Live in the Northwest for any length of time, and you will learn the name of D.B. Cooper. On Thanksgiving Eve, November 24th, 1971, the man using that name bought a ticket from Portland to Seattle on Northwest Airlines Flight 305 and showed the stewardess what looked like a bomb. On the ground in Seattle, he demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. As the plane flew south again, he bailed out over La Center, just north of Portland. The FBI never found Cooper, never found his parachute, and only years later found a few remnants of the money on a Columbia River beach.
Just about everybody knows that he was the only successful hijacker that ever got away.
Jim Housley, former assistant U.S. attorney from Salt Lake City, Utah, thinks he met and prosecuted the man who once called himself Dan Cooper.
The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, and the evidence that I've disclosed to you would, I think, would be used, and in my view, would have a fair chance of convincing a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that it was McCoy who committed the Cooper hijacking. When the FBI finally caught up with him, he pulled a gun on the FBI agents that were trying to arrest him, and they shot him and killed him. That basically is a short form of the story of D.B. Cooper. Pardon me, that's the story of Richard McCoy.
That's right, Richard McCoy. And who is Richard McCoy?
And I can tell you from 20-plus years in the FBI that if, in fact, we could have made McCoy as D.B. Cooper, we would have done it. End of story.
The FBI special agent in charge in Portland, Robin Montgomery, has a simple answer for questions about D.B. Cooper and Richard McCoy.
At this point, he has been eliminated as a suspect.
He fit. He fit perfectly.
Although Housley never prosecuted McCoy for the Cooper case, he did indict and convict him for another airplane hijacking. Less than 6 months after D.B. Cooper bailed out with $200,000, former U.S. Army Green Beret Richard McCoy hijacked United Airlines Flight 855 from Denver to Los Angeles. McCoy hijacked the plane, diverted it to San Francisco, demanded parachutes and $500,000, and then he bailed out over Utah. 2 days later, the FBI arrested McCoy at his home in Provo. A search of the house turned up the grenade, the gun, and $499,970 in cash.
He was a daredevil, very courageous. He just was a fellow that had no fear.
He had demolition training. He was a fixed-wing pilot. He flew helicopters. And he, unusual with most crimes, he had the ability to look you right in the eye and scare you half to death.
He had been to Vietnam twice. He was highly decorated.
Russ Callum and Bernie Rhodes wrote the book on McCoy, literally. D.B. Cooper, the real McCoy, spells out dozens of connections between the two cases. And these are no ordinary book authors. Rhodes headed the federal parole and probation system in Utah for 20 years. Callum worked as an FBI special agent for 25 years before retiring as head of the Salt Lake office. The FBI here in Salt Lake City came to know Richard McCoy very well, and they believed that their case looked amazingly similar to the Cooper hijacking less than 6 months before. McCoy possessed a pilot's understanding of terminology and procedures. He had paratroop training and demolition training from the Army, and he knew law enforcement procedures from going to school in that area and from his friends who worked in that community. The FBI agents in Salt Lake City worked hard on the theory that McCoy might be Cooper, but they weren't in charge of the Cooper case. Those agents were hundreds of miles away in Seattle, Washington, and they didn't believe that Richard McCoy was Dan Cooper.
They made some very blatant mistakes.
Bernie Rhodes points out that D.B. Cooper created a whole new kind of crime, skyjacking for the purpose of extortion. He says the FBI had never handled that kind of crime before. Years later, Rhodes talked to one of the FBI agents who worked the Cooper case.
He said, you know, we'd made a lot of mistakes and we were scolded by Washington, D.C.
What kind of mistakes? Well, Rhodes points out that the FBI never collected magazines and other articles from the plane that Cooper touched, evidence that might have provided the man's fingerprints. The plane landed in Reno, and Rhodes says the FBI let the tiny Reno crime lab process the evidence. The FBI in Salt Lake City had problems following up on the McCoy-Cooper connection. Callum, who was retiring when agents arrested McCoy in the United hijacking, says he briefed the man who took over the Salt Lake FBI office.
He didn't have any interest in it. It wasn't, I couldn't understand his lack of interest.
Yet there seems good reason to believe Cooper and McCoy were the same man. Start with the way they look.
And if you compare the picture that the witnesses to the D.B. Cooper case came up with this aid of a police artist, it looks exactly like Richard McCoy.
Former prosecutor Jim Housley.
Well, the modus operandi, the MO, had McCoy's signature all over it.
The man who hijacked Northwest Flight 305 called himself Dan Cooper. The news media apparently changed it to DB. He used notes typed ahead of time to tell the pilot where to fly the plane. Richard McCoy, a helicopter and fixed-wing pilot, did exactly the same thing on United Airlines Flight 855 6 months later.
And it would have vectors and directions and things like that on it that were things that that an ordinary person like myself, or maybe like you, wouldn't know about.
The hijackers used something a bit more unique than typing paper for their notes.
They used aviation flight plans, both of them. There wasn't any way Richard McCoy would have known about that because those had been protected. That kind of evidence in the D.B. Cooper case was protected by the FBI.
You'll see in both cases, Cooper and McCoy, that he used what we, well, how would you best describe it? I guess it would be pilot lingo and aft staircase, interphone.
The flight crews of both planes remember the hijacker kept using the phrase, "no funny stuff." Both hijackers specified where the refueling truck should be parked, probably to prevent the FBI from using it as cover during an assault on the plane. Rhodes and Callum say McCoy's hijacking showed improvements from the Cooper case. Each hijacker had a stewardess nearby to carry notes to the pilot.
In the Cooper case, he had her sit pretty much alongside of him. In the McCoy case, he had her sit in front of him. Much improvement there. Because she couldn't look and turn around and really study him and see him and look at his hand.
In the Cooper case, the FBI delivered the money in a bag with the zippers removed. Rhodes and Callum figure McCoy, under the name of Cooper, lost most of the money and therefore had to do a second hijacking.
He brought a duffel bag the second time, had a lot of things stored in it.
McCoy brought his own parachute and equipment to attach the money bag to his parachute harness. Another improvement, in the Cooper hijacking, the flight crew got a good look at the man through a peephole in the cockpit door.
He taped that over in the McCoy case real quick so that they couldn't use that peephole. He knew what he was doing. He really did.
Both hijacked planes were 727s, with staircases in the rear that could be lowered.
D.B. Cooper didn't know how to open that back door. D.B. Cooper had to have help, but Richard McCoy comes along about 5.5 months later. He didn't need any help from Diane Serdam. He sent her up front.
Witnesses described Cooper as dark-skinned and older, with yellow stains on his fingers.
We know in the McCoy case that he put a heavy, dark makeup on.
Former Utah FBI Chief Russ Callum figures McCoy got makeup on his first 2 fingers while putting on the makeup in the Cooper case, and the crew mistook it for nicotine stains from smoking.
They both sat in the same seat, and one of them, Cooper, left the string tie, which Tina Mucklow was the stewardess, gave to the FBI and told them that she'd seen D.B. Cooper take the tie off.
The Seattle FBI office confirms that it still has a thin black tie and a mother-of-pearl tie tack that D.B. Cooper left on the plane.
D.B. Cooper left a clue on the airplane. The clue that he left on the airplane was a tie tack, a very distinctive tie tack.
Former prosecutor Jim Housley figures that clue ties McCoy to Cooper.
In the investigation of the McCoy case, they found a Polaroid picture of McCoy wearing a tie with that tie tack.
McCoy's mother-in-law and his sister-in-law were both shown a photograph of the tie clasp and the necktie. And their reaction was that that's like McCoy's, or that is McCoy's.
Denise in particular, according to Jim Tyson, said, well, that's Richard's. Where'd you fellas get it? And he said, well, we got it off of the D.B. Cooper plane, and she broke into tears.
The FBI says the tie does not link McCoy to Cooper.
There was nothing unique about it, as you will. And then there was a simulated pearl tie clasp.
Yet the FBI, to this day, refuses to let the public see the tie because agents say it might still be used to identify the skyjacker.
Cooper was described, if you recall, as being about 45 years of age, kind of having a swarthy complexion. I think while he was in the plane, he smoked, and he did have a drink.
The FBI's Robin Montgomery points out that as a Mormon, McCoy neither drank nor did he smoke. But Callum and Rhodes point out that McCoy used to do both before he converted. Would a man careful enough to wear makeup and a wig, as McCoy did in one hijacking, disguise himself in other ways?
I think he could have smoked him to throw you off.
There were a couple of inconsistencies.
The FBI insists McCoy could not have committed the Cooper hijack.
One, McCoy was back at his residence in Utah, I think that Thanksgiving Day, which would have been the day after the hijacking.
The man who called himself D.B. Cooper hijacked that Northwest Airlines jet on Thanksgiving Eve. Now, Richard McCoy's family says that he spent the Thanksgiving holiday right here in Provo, Utah, that he helped cook dinner on Thanksgiving Day and stayed all evening. But authors Russ Callum and Bernie Rhodes say the documents they dug up show something entirely different. They show that Richard McCoy, a devout Mormon, a non-smoker, a non-drinker, and a non-gambler, wasn't here in Provo. He was 372 miles away in Las Vegas.
There was gasoline bought by a fellow driving a Volkswagen with a North Carolina plate assigned to McCoy, okay? And he signed a gas ticket on his credit card, and the FBI laboratory said he wrote the signature, Richard McCoy.
And where was that gas bought?
And that gas was bought at that thrust station, power thrust station, just west of the airport, McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas.
Half a mile from that gas station sits the Tropicana Hotel and Casino,
where he made a phone call from a commercial phone. Now, the other thing that puts him, there was a phone call made from the Tropicana Collect to McCoy's home at 11, was it 11:10 or 10:10, that evening, Thanksgiving evening.
What is a man that doesn't shoot dice, play blackjack, drink whiskey, chase women, smoke cigarettes, do in Las Vegas, Nevada on Thanksgiving?
Bernie Rhodes thinks he knows the answer to that question.
Probably when he got back from Portland, laundered the money there at the Tropicana, or maybe a number of hotels, and then got on the phone and called home, and he said, "It's over, I'm on my way." I think that's a logical thing to do.
The Federal Marshal Service assigned one man to guard Richard McCoy during his trial. John Seiler says McCoy talked openly about his own hijacking, the one he was on trial for, and he says McCoy claimed to know something about the Cooper hijacking, something that only Dan Cooper would have known at the time.
He said that in the Cooper case, when Cooper bailed out and his chute opened, the jolt jarred the money from his grasp, and he lost the money.
John Seiler assumed that McCoy had read something in the newspaper. Only years later, when some of the money turned up, did Seiler realize that McCoy knew something that only Cooper should have known.
Well, he lost all but I think around $10,000 or $12,000.
Rhodes points out that Cooper had to contend with a bank bag full of money from which the FBI had removed all zippers.
The woman, the stewardess, did see him take apart a chute, if you will, cut the shrouds, the nylon shrouds, and it looked like he was tying the money up in a package to make it tighter.
Callum says that when Cooper let some of the stewardesses go in Seattle, Cooper did a Robin Hood.
He offered him a pack. A pack of 100 is $2,000.
Offered one to each of the gals that were getting off of the plane. And he said, "Here, take those. It's Thanksgiving, and you've been nice to me," or something to that effect.
The crew turned down the offer, and Cooper stuffed the packs into his suit. Rhodes and Callum figured Cooper, or McCoy, lost the money, all of it except what he had pocketed. His close friends told Northwest Reports that McCoy, who was in school at the time on the GI Bill and whose wife did social work, was always short of money.
Then, after the Cooper jump in November of '71, he took his sister-in-law, his wife, and 2 children and flew them back to Carolina. He paid for that right off to the credit card company. Now we're talking about a sizable amount. He bought new tires for his car. He did a number of things that showed that money was a little easier.
A judge sentenced McCoy to 45 years in a federal prison. 2 years later, he escaped and began robbing banks. 4 months later, the FBI caught up with him. He fired 1 shot. 3 agents shot back, killing him.
I can only tell you that this case is still unsolved as far as the FBI is concerned.